Hi, I'm Tony Allen Bernier, and in this video I'm going to show you how to make a cool pair of mittens using one of my kit style patterns. Just about anyone can do this. If you can punch a hole and put a needle through it, you can make yourself a pair of mittens. Every single hole is marked, so all you need to do is tape the pattern to your piece of leather, punch where it says punch a hole, cut it out, and sew along with the video. There will be 6 different sizes from extra small to extra large, and with tick marks on the pattern, if you want to sew it on the machine, you can do that also. I'm having a lot of fun making these mitten patterns, so with that said, I'm going to have at least 2 more videos coming out. I'm going to be doing standard mittens for like everyday use. I'm going to do a work mitten pattern pack, and I'm going to do a ski mitten pattern pack, all of which are going to have a 1 and 3 finger version, a 2 and 2 finger version, and the standard mitten version. If you don't want to miss any of those or any other free patterns and videos I put out, you can subscribe to my channel. It helps my channel grow. It helps me be able to put more free content out. And as always, a big thanks to the Leathercrafters and Saddlers Journal for sponsoring my channel. They have a great publication and do a ton for the crafting community. I suggest checking them out. A couple things to cover real quick before we get started. If you're going to be making your lining using this pattern, if it's thinner, you can use just the next size down. It'll stretch to your hand. But if you're going to do a thick lining, and if the lining is stiffer material, you're going to want to do the lining the size of your hand and then make the shell of the mitt one size bigger. I usually use pre-made glove liners, and I get most of those on Amazon. The best thread to use is going to be a waxed polyester thread. I get mine from Main Thread Company, but the polyester has a better UV rating, so you're not going to have to deal with any breakdown over time. And I like to use the waxed. I feel like it just locks the stitches in better, and it helps kind of seal the mitten up. For the leather, I suggest using a 2 to 3 ounce. If you're going to be using the 3 ounce, it might be a good idea to skive some of those edges. I show that in the video, but that's more so if you have the fingered mittens, because that's going to be a lot of layers coming in between. And even so, it could still work, just have a longer break-in period. And for like a standard mitten, you really don't have to worry about that at all. Start by getting your base measurement. You can use one of these tape measures right around your palm above your thumb there. Or you can grab a string and do the same. Go around, mark where it goes to, and then hold that up to a ruler, and that's going to give you your measurement. So cut your parts out just outside the line, tape them down to your leather. And the first thing I like to do is punch out these marked holes and mark them on the back side, making sure to come in towards the center on this one so that it won't show on the outside edge. You can cut it out with a utility knife or a pair of scissors. I find that scissors work better for the real tight curves right here. If you're using a thicker 3 ounce or maybe a 3 ounce that's a little stiff, or you just want the glove to be a little bit thinner at the seams, each one of these parts where it will be across that main seam so it'll be doubled up, you can skive the back side of these a little bit. Usually if I'm worried about it, I only skive the gusset for the fingered glove. But like underneath here, you can see, since that's going to be 3 layers once it's sewn to the glove, that sometimes skiving these reinforcement panels might be a good idea. And what I like to do too is mark where the stitches are going to be, just to make sure I keep behind there. So if I'm going to skive, I want to make sure I only get that very edge and stay away from where the stitches are going to be. A sharp skiver is always good. But like I said, in most situations, I just skive the edge of the finger gusset if I'm using a thicker, firmer 3 ounce. But for this situation, I probably will just leave this alone. So when you're putting that welting in the mitt, what I do is I just print off either the left or the right, because you only need one of the weltings per mitt. And since it's already a mirror image from the palm side and the back of the hand, you just use each one of these to make a welt, and that'll be for each glove. You assemble the pattern for each side, and you're going to cut it out like you did before, just short of that line. But this time, since we're going to be cutting it out on that gray line, we'll just take this pattern and do the same on this inside line. Cut just inside of that gray line. To know which way the welts go, since it's not the exact curve on both sides here, there's going to be a marked hole on the final pattern, and when you punch that hole, mark it on the back side of the parts and the welt itself. That way you know whichever way you want to flip it, if you want the smooth side up or the flesh side up, as long as that hole lines up with either the left or the right mitt, you can just swap these back and forth. If you want to punch the holes, punch that first marked hole and mark it on the back, but going away from the center, because it's actually the inside edge that's going to show, since you're going to be reversing the mitt. So you want to mark it going away from the inside. And with this one, since I'm not punching holes, I just took an awl and poked it on the side of this hole and then used that as a reference to mark it, so I knew that mark wouldn't show. And you can put all kinds of parts in the middle here so you're not wasting leather. But what I'm going to do, instead of cutting around this curve, I'm just going to cut straight and keep going instead of going around that curve. I want to see how that will look. It will go all the way to the edge of that mitten. If you cut that curve, it will come in early and hide that edge nicely. Just remember, this outside edge actually is going to be hidden, so it's when you're cutting this inside edge that you want to make it as straight as you can. If you're using a real thick 3-ounce or something that's real rigid, you may want to skive this welting as well as the glove itself. The thing is it's a little bit reversed. You would think you would need to skive this inside edge because that's the shape of the glove, but it's the opposite, because when you flip it inside out, this inside edge will become the outside edge. So if you're skiving this, make sure you skive this outside edge and keep it away from the stitching holes. Start by sewing these ends here. As you come through, make sure that bottom thread always goes down and away, or vice versa. You just want to make sure you come in on the same side every time so those stitches look uniform. When you're coming across this section, you want to pull snug, but not too tight to where you're really bunching that up. Just make sure you get them tight enough. This isn't a stress point across these threads, so you don't need to worry about getting them as tight as some of this other stuff. When you're sewing the reinforcement panels on, you want to make sure to get the stitches snug, but you don't want to overly tighten them or you're going to get bunching. And while you're going, you will notice a very small amount of bunching just because you're tightening the stitches. But that little bit after you go through, if you just give it a little tug, it'll tighten those stitches up and straighten everything out. And if that little tug like that doesn't straighten it out, then you're going too tight. All the reinforcement panels are sewn on, and you can see with this one I didn't sew around that inside perimeter. We'll just do all 3 layers at the same time, and same with the edge. That'll all be sewn when we sew the parts together. Now to put the elastic on, there's a couple different ways. You can sew the edge with a sewing machine. Just make sure you get it past where that stitch line is going to be. Sew one side and then the other, and then stretch across. The other method is to use some glue. And again, make sure you're keeping it past where the stitches are going to be. Doesn't take a whole lot. You really only need it to hold long enough so you can sew the parts together. So once you get all the sewing done, you won't need the glue to be holding this. And you can see I put a little mark in between the two stitch lines and in the center of that, so I can just kind of line it up, make sure I get it right in the center. I like to go past the edge just a little bit to make sure this doesn't fray and let go later on. So while that dries, I'll put up that video of the sewing machine method for this, and then I'll show you how I sew this by hand. What you want to do is sew this just to the very end, away from where that seam is going to be, otherwise it's going to show and mess everything up. I like to pass the edge just a little bit with the elastic. That way I don't have to worry about it letting go and fraying. And also you want to melt this end with a lighter. That'll help too. With each end fastened, we can just grab one of them, flatten it out, and just get started. You can go one right in the middle, but I like to do 2 stitch lines. So that's the middle, and I'll go over just a little bit. The trick is not to just pull on this and let the sewing machine do all the work. You're going to want to grab this end to help pull it through. If you got to go just a couple stitches at a time until you can really get a hold of it behind here. And I also take a look and make sure I'm aiming right straight across where I want that to finish. And it can help to pinch it right there so you have a visual. And if you're moving stuff around and pulling, make sure that needle's down in the leather. Otherwise you're going to slide it around and lose your stitch line. The other thing I like to do is try to get this placed so those stitches are spaced the same. And that will kind of start to bunch more once the leather gets used to where it wants its wrinkles and folds and whatnot. And I usually use this thicker stuff too, or the wider stuff I should say, because when this is on your hand, it kind of forms a little barrier to catch the snow and whatnot. Now that the glue is dry, we can start sewing this. We will need to stretch this as we're sewing. So what I'll do is start on one side, but I go one off of where those 2 stitch lines are, just to kind of hold it across there a little bit better while we're doing all this. You don't want to try to just force the needle through. Wiggle it around so the elastic and the fibers in that kind of get spread apart so you're not tearing any of it. Those extra stitches just help hold that end so it doesn't let go. And I'll just get one stitch started. And you can put this in a vise or something that holds the one side. It makes it so much easier if you have an extra hand free. And since my vise is kind of slippery on the inside and I'm going to be pulling on it, I just have a couple little pieces of rubber here. This is a chunk of belt from a piece of farm equipment. As we sew across here, make sure you're pulling it so you get that full stretch. And if you let go and pull, you're going to get too much bunching up, and that thread's not going to have enough slack to stretch back out. And one way to make sure you don't overly tighten the stitches is tighten them only when you have the pull going here. So that's going to be enough. That way you can still stretch this out. Just repeat the process for the second row of stitches. The only thing to watch is in between these two rows, sometimes it might bunch up to make a little roll. So what I'll do is I'll grab it back further on my pointer finger and thumb so that I have something underneath to press up. That way it flattens that out. With the thumb piece here, we're going to sew around this edge, but we're going to pull it a little tighter. Almost bunch it up just a little bit, because then when you stretch that leather out, those stitches will really tighten up and lock it in. By doing that, the stitches aren't going to show once we flip this back through. You can see just a little bit of bunching. That way, once this is done, it'll really lock those stitches in tight. And while I'm stitching, I still come through and go to the same side every time, just in case any stitches do show. It'll look more uniform. I will mention, if you're sewing this on a machine, you don't have to worry about getting that bunch, because that machine's going to lock them stitches down tight anyhow. But when you get to the end here, go around the outside with each thread, and then you're going to back stitch like 4 to lock it in. You could just tie a knot as well, but if you have this nice waxed polyester thread, usually back stitching like 4 is going to be enough. You can see that marked hole here, so we'll start with that. This marked hole right here. And this will go right like that. So we'll come through that hole. That last hole where the two sides are sewn together on this is considered the same hole. So you can just pick one side or the other, come through. It could be helpful to grab a couple clips while you're messing around with this panel here, just so it doesn't keep falling out. First couple stitches are going to be a little difficult just because everything doesn't want to stay aligned. Once you get going, it gets easier. And it can be helpful just to go one layer at a time. Make sure you're getting through the right hole each time. With these stitches, you are going to want to tighten them a little bit more again, so you get just a little bit of bunching, like when we sewed the thumb piece together. Once you get a couple stitches in, a little trick you can use is once you get that needle through all 3 layers, pinch it real close to that hole so everything stays aligned. So you can pull that through and then get this one back through pretty easily. Just be very vigilant about looking and making sure you're not missing a skip on either side, that each layer is going through the correct hole. You will want to pull it tight enough to get just a little bit of bunching, not much, and you can flip it back over to check as you go. When you go around the back side of the thumb, you can see the thumb part itself will have a little bit more wrinkling on that edge, since more fabric will need to come in and curl in right here. But as long as you're pulling those stitches tight, you'll be fine. Once you get to the other end, it can be helpful to go past one stitch where you started and then start back stitching, at least 4 to really lock these stitches in. You can tie a knot. Just make sure you pull the thread in between a couple of layers, tie a knot, maybe push it down in there a little bit. You don't want that digging into your hand. Looks pretty good. I like to give it a little bit of a pull just to lock those stitches in a little better. Be careful, especially up at this point. If you pull real hard, you could tear. Just stretch that out and lock them stitches in. There's a couple different ways you can start to sew the finger gusset on the fingered mitten. You can use these center holes and start right on that center hole, like I do in my other mitten video. Or you can use the marked holes on the ends and start on one of the ends and work your way all the way around. You can see on this mitten, I'll be sewing the finger gusset by hand, but then the rest of it by machine. So I'll just sew each side on separately and then finish it off with the machine. Either way, if you're starting on that center hole or one of these end ones, I like to set this down good sides facing each other, and then the first hole that comes up to it is the hole you'll start on, so that when you flip it right side out, you'll have the seam the correct way, because it's easy to think you need to set it like that, but then it's going to be wrong. So I'll set it like this, and then the first hole that comes up, that's the hole we're going to start on, and I'm going to start on this end here. As you tighten this, make sure you tighten it so you have just a little bit of bunching. That way when we stretch this out, those stitches will lock in real tight and they won't show. Just that little bit of bunching as you go. Make sure those stitches will stay tight enough. So when you get to the hole right before this one here, you got these 3 around this corner, add this reinforcement piece. And it helps to just go 1 layer at a time as you're coming around this corner, just to make sure you hit each hole you need to hit. make sure this kind of comes around the corner nicely. It can help to grab the gusset and kind of direct those folds in there so it can come around this corner. Once you get around the corner, you can start pinching close to the stitch hole. It'll keep them lined up so you don't have to go one layer at a time. Just make sure you're pulling the stitches tight enough to get just that small amount of bunching. Once you get to the end here, just back stitch 4. You can tie a knot, but since this isn't like a mitten that will have a liner in it, I don't want that knot digging into a finger or anything. Usually fine either way, but I just like to back stitch it if there isn't going to be any lining in it. With both mittens, the fingered and the standard mitten, once you're done getting the two sides, you just start on the end and go all the way around. And we will put this little jobber in here. That way you can put a little clip or something on there and clip it to your belt or something like that. And what I like to do is come around the end to just lock these two layers together a little bit better. And the whole time around this perimeter, you do want to tighten it to get that little bit of bunching as well. And once I get past that double layer for that hem, that's where I'll put this in. You can put this wherever you want. There is a mark, a suggested mark on the pattern if you want to just follow that. While you're getting past this elastic, you may need to go one layer at a time since it kind of pulls the holes out of alignment. Make sure to put a little bit of bunching in as you go around the whole perimeter. Make sure those stitches are good and tight. With each side done, the gusset on here, we can put these two panels together. If you're sewing it completely by hand, you'll just do the same thing and start on this end and work your way all the way around. Everything will line up fine. But if you're using those pre-marked holes so you can sew the gusset by hand and finish it up quicker with the machine, I'll sew the other side of this gusset on here and then just start here and finish it up quick with the machine. Just double check, make sure that's the right one. And I'll place this with the good side up on top of that. And then this will just be sewn together like that. When we turn it inside out, everything will look nice. So this first hole right here, we'll go through. I'll sew this together, then cut that excess off right to line up with that. As you pass this elastic here, you may have to check and make sure each hole is lined up as you sew through each layer here. But like before, once you get the needle through, if you pinch that real good, it should stay lined. And if you don't like using quite as much thread to get all the way around, you can do it in sections and tie it off. Last thing to do will be to turn this right side out. I like to start with the finger since that's a bit harder. Just get the very tip rolled in a little bit. You don't want to force it. You could pull stitches a little bit too much. Once you get it going, it gets easier here. And you can grab a marker or something to kind of help press it in. Just don't push real hard. Just take your time. Obviously the full mitten is going to be easier. If you're looking for a lot more tips and tricks, my standard mitten video has a few more extra things. If you're just a beginner, that might be a good one to watch through. I tried to keep this one a little bit shorter, but and then just get this other side. And sometimes right in here it'll be pulling weird because what you want is the gusset to be folded down, and you may need to get in there, just kind of roll it to make sure that seam allowance folds down in there and get that crease worked in a little bit.